Ireland.
Yes, that's right. There are
From what I understand.
46 of our
Yeah.
most active congregants are
46 is how many? Yeah, it's,
46.
so, yeah, okay, you're live.
All right, everyone, let's get started. Week 2 of our conversations about Presbyterians, Native Americans, Pennsylvania history, and those sorts of things. Last week, if you were here, or you could watch it on YouTube, I guess, we talked about the Paxton boys and the Conestoga massacre and the Presbyterian. I tried to suggest there's a Presbyterian angle to the story, but not to make too much of it. With John Elder and Calvinist theology and those sorts of things. Today, I don't necessarily want to focus on dairy or things. There was a dairy connection, if you remember, to last week's with Elder. Today, I want to give a much kind of broader sense of Presbyterians and Native Americans on the frontier. And it may be a story that you're unfamiliar with. It may be a story of a figure that you are unfamiliar with. A Presbyterian itinerant minister named Philip Vickers Fithian was his name. I'll introduce him to you in a second, but he is this Presbyterian itinerant preacher that I'm talking about here on the frontier. The interesting thing about Fithian is, and I apologize in advance, he was not a Scots-Irish Presbyterian. He was an English Presbyterian who descended from Puritans who migrated down into New Jersey, and then you'll see the rest of the story here in a second, how he winds up in the upper Susquehanna River Valley preaching to Presbyterians and interacting with Native Americans. I'm going to grab something real quick. I know I'm going off camera here. I'll be right back. I just realized I have something I want to consult here. So the other thing I want to suggest about this lecture is this is a lecture in what historians call microhistory. Now I don't know if you've heard that term before, but microhistory is something that's a lot of professional historians engage in this. It's taking one particular story, a very local story, a very short-lived story from the past, and then teasing out from that one little local incident larger questions about, in our case, about Presbyterian theology, about racial engagement with Native Americans, about Native American culture. So I want to tell you a little story to start, and then I want to tease out with you all of the implications that this one little story has for these bigger questions that are about Presbyterianism 300, 250 years ago. As you guys celebrate, you all celebrate your 300th anniversary. So this will be a much more contextual lecture, thinking about maybe Dairy Church in a kind of larger framework. So I want to start by introducing you very briefly, and then I'm going to go into more detail, to this man, Philip Vickers Fithian. This is a portrait of him, or at least we think it's a portrait of him, chalk portrait that was taken while he served as a chaplain during the American Revolution, which is actually came after the story I'm going to tell you today. And this is a map of some of the places where Fithian visited in 1775. So again, right on the eve of the Revolution is the story that we're discussing today. Some of you who have, been up to Lycoming or the Penn State area, Northumberland, Sunbury, those kinds of places, this is where we're going to be spending most of our time thinking about and talking about today. Now, how did I find, let me just give you some background. Who is this guy, Philip Vickers Fithian? Has anyone heard of him? How did I find this guy? My first book was called The Way of Improvement Leads Home, Philip Vickers Fithian and the Rural Enlightenment in Early America, published in 2008. And one day I was poking around in the archives at Princeton University, where we know Presbyterian, founded as a Presbyterian university, as the College of New Jersey. And talking to the archivist, he said to me, you should look at the Fithian papers. So I said, I'm familiar with Philip Vickers Fithian because he had visited, and I'll talk about this in a second, he had visited a plantation prior to this and served as a tutor for a wealthy Virginia planter named Robert Carter III. So I said, you mean the Virginia Fithian, the one who had a diary about when he lived in Virginia? And I said, and he said, yeah, but you realize there's 8 more kind of volumes of his manuscript papers that have nothing to do with Virginia, that very few people have looked at. So I said, wow, I was interested in Presbyterians and Presbyterian history. So I started digging in, and the result was publishing his story. Again, it's an academic book, but many people say that it kind of, especially if you're a Presbyterian and like Presbyterian history, there's a lot of stories in the book too. Like there's a love story, there's a story of him on the frontier I'm going to tell today, there's the story of Virginia and so forth. So this is this guy. Again, more on his bio here in a second. So let me go back before I get to that. So let me tell the story by simply, I'll try to read in a entertaining way, but I'm going to tell the story by reading my account of what happened, and a lot of this is based on diaries too, so I'll use quotes when I'm quoting Fithian. And then I want to take this story, this short story I'm going to read you, and then tease out the implications, talk a little bit about what this teaches us. So let me set some context here. I'll go back to this. I'll go back to this map. So Philip Vickers Fithian, 1775. He graduated from Princeton, the College of New Jersey. He's assigned by the Presbytery I want to say the Presbyterian of Philadelphia, who ordained him, to go out and engage with the new Presbyterian settlements in the upper Susquehanna and along the sort of western branch of the Susquehanna River. Fithian is very young at the time. He's probably in his mid-20s when he makes this trip. He's a rookie. That's why they send him out here, right? To get some experience preaching. And many of these settlements out here, with maybe the exception of Northumberland, but many of these more western Susquehanna River settlements down along the Allegheny Mountains here are relatively new. Pennsylvania has finally given permission for some of these settlers, and many of them are Scots-Irish, to settle this area in 1769. So while there have been people there before 1769, they have finally gotten approval by the colony of Pennsylvania to form official settlements recognized by the government and the Penn family in Pennsylvania. So Fithian's going to go out there because of the large numbers of Scots-Irish who have now looking for more land, moving to places where they can, build houses and develop villages. So that's the context, right? So here's Philip showing up. So he spent some time in Northumberland, which is the kind of port town on the Susquehanna in this area, kind of the center of population. And then here's the story. After he left Northumberland town, as it was known back then, Philip began to mention more frequently his encounters with Native Americans. By the time of his arrival, white settlement had pushed most of the upper Susquehanna Valley's diverse native population to the west. We talked a little bit about this last week. Indians, however, could still be found trading venison and skins in white communities. Their presence was enough to get Philip's attention. As he reached Lycoming Creek near present-day Williamsport, Pennsylvania, Philip noted that he was now entering what he called Indian country. He saw his first 2 Indians at Bald Eagle Creek and remarked in his journal that he could not, quote, bring myself to pleasant feeling when I look upon or even think of these heathenish savages, unquote. Again, 18th century stuff. It's a quote, right? As he rode through the woods to Bald Eagle's Nest, which is present-day Milesburg, Pennsylvania, he was, quote, terrified very much, unquote, by what he described as the, quote, whoop, whoop of 2 Indians nearby. Philip was certain that a horde of Indians, quote, who were lying in ambush, unquote, would leap from the woods to, quote, shoot us when we disturbed their property, unquote. Later, he described these yellings as hollowing and frantic screams, not less fearful than inebriated demons, howling till we were out of hearing, unquote. His host in these parts of the woods, Andrew Boggs, invited Indians into his home to trade. On one particular morning, 3 of them showed up for morning prayers, sitting motionless on the floor as Philip conducted the exercises. Philip's most harrowing experience with Indians, however, occurred one July evening when he was awakened from sleep by, quote, 6 large Indians, unquote, who had arrived at Boggs' house with knife and tomahawk in hand. The Indians did not harm him, but they certainly gave him a scare. After this experience, Philip could only conclude, quote, for all this settlement I would not live here, for not for 500 pounds a year, nothing would persuade me, unquote. Indians remained a concern throughout Philip's trip, but the conditions he experienced among the white settlements in this part of the Pennsylvania backcountry received the most attention in his diary. If Philip was ever a quote-unquote insufferable prig, unquote, as the early 20th century editors of his journal described him, it was during this stage of his preaching tour. He felt out of place among these settlements and made his thoughts about the residents' uncivilized ways of life abundantly clear on the pages of his journal. His refined sensibilities were most evident in his remarks about the unclean houses in which he was forced to stay. Andrew Boggs' cabin, for example, looked and smelled like a shambles, unquote, as a result of his practice of trading venison and other animal meat with the Indians, who frequently stopped by unannounced. Philip commented on the, quote, raw flesh and blood in every part, mangled, wasted flesh on every shelf, hounds licking up the blood from the floor, unquote. He had a way with words. He had a habit of judging, privately of course, the Presbyterian gentleman, the people he encountered based on their attention to cleanliness. And then it goes on and he starts talking about how these white people that he was encountering, these Scots-Irish Presbyterians, were so uncivilized, they mixed with the native peoples in everyday life. He talks about them wearing moccasins, quote-unquote moccasins or Indian shoes, right? You know, again, these were the Presbyterians that he was meeting, right? Let alone what he thought about the natives. I think we've already got a good sense of that. So there's a little bit more to the story, you know, it's in there. But what do we make of this story, right? You know, here's this little encounter, right? One description, multiple descriptions of a particular period, probably about a week in time, of Fithian, a good Presbyterian, good Princeton man, right, who comes out to the upper Susquehanna River and encounters these Native American peoples. Well, here's where I want to go with this. So first, let's think about the people who usually don't get discussed. Who were these people that Fithian encountered, these natives? Right? Let's just get some context for that. A little bit of this will repeat some of the things we talked about last time. But first, it's worth noting that in terms of the number of natives he encountered out there, they were very few. Probably there were a couple dozen Native Americans living in this region at the time. The amount of coverage that Fithian gives to these Indians well exceeds the actual number that were actually there, right? So, you know, he's sort of generalizing about this Native American culture that's actually very, very small. We'll talk again more about that in a second. We'll talk about it now. The reason they're so small, for multiple reasons, they have survived disease and war. Most likely, again, we don't know who these Native Americans he encountered were, but most likely this was a kind of ethnic mix of Susquehannock Indians, maybe even some old Iroquois tribe Indians who had come down to fight the Susquehannocks generations before. There were probably some Lenape Indians in the mix. But the point is, these Indians were decimated by disease. And in fact, right around the turn of the century, 1700, there were probably about 7,500 Indians living in this area, this sort of upper Susquehanna or western Susquehanna area. By the time Fidian arrives, like I said, there's probably a few dozen. Now, some of them have been killed by warfare, especially the French and Indian War and other minor skirmishes. I'm sure John Elder and his company maybe have killed a few. But overwhelmingly, they have died over the course of 2 centuries from their contact with European traders who had moved through this territory. Again, settlements not really until the 1740s, 50s, and 60s. But traders are moving through there. And of course, traders carry with them disease. And of course, many of these Native American peoples in the early 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, early 1700s are and some of you know the story, are living in isolation. They have not encountered the kind of pathogens, as medical historians call them, that they don't have an immunity to these diseases. So there's somewhat of a kind of almost a cultural and there's death obviously, but there's also what comes with death is kind of a cultural holocaust, right? Which we'll talk about here in a second. Like when your whole society is wiped out, you obviously mourn the dead. You are no longer as populated as you once were. But there are also social and cultural implications of that. So for example, these Indians, these Native Americans, and by the way, I should add something here. I should say something here because there's a lot of debate about the use of the word Indians to describe, like baseball teams changed their name to Cleveland, right? Most Native American historians, some of the leading Native American historians, as well as many Native American tribal people, are still very, very comfortable using the term Indian to describe these people. In fact, there's an entire school of historical thought known as the New Indian History. In this kind of politically correct kind of world we live in, there are obviously implications to naming things, teams and that kind of thing, Indians, like the Washington football team and all that kind of stuff. But in the scholarly world, Indians, Native Americans are often used interchangeably. Sometimes when I give public talks, someone will come up to me and they'll say, like, you're using the term Indian, and we're offended by that. And if they are, I just won't use it. but this is perfectly suitable. We had a Messiah, Philip Deloria, who is the son of Vine Deloria, who's one of the great Indian activists of the 20th century. His son is a historian, teaches at Harvard now. And I asked him this question. He was like, we use it all the time. So anyways, I just want to clarify that, that I'm going to use both those terms interchangeably, and I don't kind of feel guilty or like I'm doing something wrong by saying that. So these Indians, these Native Americans, had survived disease, they had survived war, and the cultural implications were they were politically homeless. I think that's where I was at. Prior to European encounters, and maybe in the first several generations of European encounters with Indians, whether they be in Pennsylvania or anywhere else, there is a deep sense of cultural, social, but especially political identity among these Native Americans. When you think of a Native American tribe, think of them as more of an ethnic group, right? Each ethnic group has their own political organization, right, in the Native American case, but they also have their own beliefs. They also have their own gods in the case of Native Americans. They also have their own creation stories. They have an entire kind of culture that holds them together politically and forms a group right, that defines themselves against another group of Native Americans. To think about, the one critique I would have of the word Indian is it's a European term. In other words, it's the Europeans who just basically said, you are all Indians, right? But as the Indians understood themselves, they were unique ethnic groups with very different stories, creation accounts, so forth, right? By the time you get to 1775, because of the consequences of disease and war, these Native American people groups have been forced to adapt in terms of their political identities. So when you've lost everyone, you've lost your wise men who are in an oral culture, are the ones who remember the stories, remember the history, remember the religious beliefs, remember the theological concerns that your tribe has about the gods and so forth. When you lose all that, you are then forced for your own protection against other Native American tribes and groups and Europeans to unite, to come together. And that's what an Indian nation is. So when you think of the Iroquois or some of we don't see these in Pennsylvania as much, but somewhere like the Catawba Indians or the Cherokee, those Indians, they are nations of tribes who have been so decimated by war and especially disease that they're forced to unite with people who are different than them. So I always tell my students, we talk all the time about the United States being like the first experiment in pluralism, where a bunch of people with different views and ethnicities came together and tried to live together and create some kind of a nation. The Native American peoples were doing that well before any European showed up. So imagine these people, in the case of these Indians that Fithian encountered, they are people with ancestries that have different creation stories, religions, ethnic practices, so forth. And they're living together in villages trying to get along with all these different views, right? It sounds familiar, right? That happens well before the United States, is my point. So they're politically homeless, they have no real sense of identity, and they have probably been shaped just as much by British, what I'll call British consumer culture, I'll define that here in a second, as they were Native American culture by this point, okay? So really it is the Europeans and their trade and their, trade in whatever it might be. Early on it was guns and alcohol. It still is alcohol at this time, but the shiny objects the Native Americans liked. They liked silverware and, various other forms of trinkets that these traders would trade with them. And they became then sort of consumed by getting access to these goods. Now, sometimes they use them in their own spiritual rituals. There's this common notion that emerges in the 19th century of the idea of the drunken Indian, right? I mean, even Ben Franklin makes a reference to the sort of alcohol that the Indians consume, right? And, it's normally viewed as a kind of, from a European perspective, right? These Indians can't control themselves, they're drunk all the time, they're lazy, blah, blah, blah. It's the way that myth is propagated. In reality, these Native Americans, many of them took, especially with alcohol, wanted alcohol to bring them what they believed, again, if you take their views seriously, what they believed, it wanted to reach a sort of higher level of consciousness. Europeans called it being drunk, right? so that they could better commune with their gods. This brought them to, so in other words, they're taking these European ideas and they're not just like, becoming more European, although they're doing that too, right? But they're incorporating these things into their own cultures, right? So here's another great example, like silverware. Some of the early missionaries would come in and they trade, and the Indians would take forks and knives, and then they would go back and they'd write in their reports, pretty soon the Indians are going to be eating like good civilized European people because they have forks and knives. And then, much to their shock, when they would go back later, they found that the Indians had melted down all of these things so that they could produce arrowheads to basically sustain their old traditional ways of fighting. So they weren't becoming like Europeans, right? So it's a little problematic. But nevertheless, by 1775, these Native Americans were fully, they were trying to practice, maybe they were practicing their own spiritual practices, and we don't know. We don't know much about these Indians Fithian encountered, but we do know in other places they were. But also, they were deeply, deeply ensconced, so to speak, within British culture, right? They knew the goods and the material things that they wanted. So they would have been very familiar with trade, and that's why they would have, felt free to kind of walk into people's homes and trade. And also the white settlers, the Scots-Irish in this region, were also pretty comfortable, not Fithian, but pretty comfortable with them, this Mr. Boggs, coming in and trading, and there was a fluidity, I guess, between the groups that Fithian never quite could understand. And we'll talk about why here in a second. Right? So those were the people groups, that we're talking about in that story that I just read to you. And this would have been the people groups that most Presbyterians on the frontier would have encountered as well. Probably the same things here could have been said about John Elder and the Paxton Boys and those people we talked about last week, how they perceived the Native Americans. Now, let's talk a little bit about Fithian. This maybe deserves some explanation, this map. But this is Fithian's home in the Cohansey River region of southern New Jersey. So try to orient yourself by being up here, right? I mean, this is the part of New Jersey where no one lives. It's very rural, it's very remote. Most people just drive through it on their way to Cape May, right? But this is one of the most concentrated per population Presbyterian regions in early America. In this region right here, you had 3 Presbyterian congregations, all within a few miles of one another. One in the town of Greenwich, which that's how they pronounced it. Greenwich, I learned that the hard way when I went down there the first time and started saying Greenwich. But no, it's Greenwich, which was over here, and then you had Fairfield Presbyterian Church, which is, still a beautiful building, 1778, I think it goes back to. It's one of those old, we were talking about Paxton Church last week. And then the Deerfield Presbyterian Church was up here. But this, I don't have a scale on this map, but this is only a few miles, the distance between these places. Heavily concentrated Presbyterian area. This is where Philip Vickers Fithian was born. He was raised in this area. He was nurtured in the Presbyterian faith. And this is where he decided, here's another map real quick just to show you. Ignore this part, but you see him here in Jersey and his travels. He actually spent some time in the Shenandoah River Valley. That's a story for another day. But here he is, and this is the area we're talking about up here, right, in Pennsylvania. But one of the most fascinating stories about Fithian is he is the first person from southern New Jersey, which is very rural in the 18th century, very remote, right? When you consider it's a 2-day wagon trip from his town to Philadelphia, right? He's very distant. Still some Lenape Indians in that area. So he grew up in maybe nothing like the Keisha-Coquillas Valley, where we were just talking about, the Penn State area, the Lycoming area, upper Susquehanna. But he grew up in a region that was not necessarily like the thriving Philadelphia metropolis either, right? He understood what it meant to live in remote, distant places. And he is the first person in southern New Jersey, if you cut when I say southern New Jersey, just cut the state in half, the south, for lack of a better, I could be more detailed about that, but it's not important for this lecture, to go to college. And his local Presbyterian minister encouraged him thought he had the ability to go to the College of New Jersey, which was the Presbyterian college at Princeton. And here's a shot of Princeton in 1764. This is about a decade before Vivian arrives there, and it is probably looks the same in 1774. Anyone ever been to Princeton? You ever been on the campus? This Nassau Hall building is still there, right? I give tours of Princeton, and I give sometimes give Presbyterian, Vivian related tours of Princeton. Like he was here, and this is the home of the president, which was occupied by several presidents. One I'm going to mention here in a second. So he goes to Princeton, and if you read his diary when he's in Princeton, he is just overwhelmed with kind of the intellectual culture of a college. He's reading things for the first time. He's coming up with new ways of thinking about the world. He writes home to his mom. Like, he's so remote in southern New Jersey, he doesn't even know, like, that he's supposed to bring a gown with him. Because when you, in the 18th century, every student wore their graduation, basically their gown, every day, right? And he didn't know that. Right? I don't know why his minister didn't tell him, but he writes these anxiety-ridden letters to his mother saying, "Is the gown ready? Do you have it sewed? You know, da 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 da." And then he writes at another point. He says, "Perhaps being here at Princeton in this great hub of intelligence, I may become another Locke or Voltaire." Like, he's dreaming about how great his intellectual growth is going to be. Surrounded by about 30 young Presbyterians, few Anglicans in the mix, all studying at this place. His classmates, James Madison, Aaron Burr, Hugh Henry Brackenridge, the poet and writer who also helped found Pittsburgh. Just an incredible list of people that he's with. When he graduates from Princeton, I mentioned this, he goes to Virginia. And this is why most people in the historical profession know him, because his diary from his experience as a tutor on a tobacco plantation in Virginia was published in the 50s. And it was read by many historians, sort of a generation or two older than me, would have read his journals. And then he gets ordained, returns to South Jersey, gets ordained by the Philadelphia Presbyterian. That region was they hate you read the records of the Philadelphia Presbyterian. It's just an aside. I usually don't bring this up when I talk about this, but since you're Presbyterians, you might appreciate that. The Philadelphia Presbyterian, they hate having to go down to South Jersey to ordain, do ordination exams, because it just takes too long. It's like 4 days there and back. It's remote. There's nothing going on down there. There are no coffee houses or places, taverns, and these kinds of places to meet and socialize, restaurants, those kinds of things. You see it every time there's someone who has to be ordained in this area. You get these, again. I may be the only one who appreciates the comment. Maybe some of you do. I don't know. So while he's at Princeton, while he's a student, and we'll get back to the frontier and the Indians in a second. He is discipled by this man. Some of you may have heard of him, right? John Witherspoon, who in 1768 becomes the president of the College of New Jersey at Princeton. He comes from Scotland. He's a Scotsman. That's a picture of a statue on the campus of Princeton. So there's a lot of controversy, by the way, now about this statue, because Witherspoon owned a couple of slaves. So they're fighting. They're trying to get this taken down, and it's this huge battle back and forth. But while what Witherspoon was trying to do to the College of New Jersey at Princeton was turn it from what might be just called a Bible college to train ministers to a college deeply rooted and steeped in the intellectual movement of the 18th century known as the Scottish Enlightenment, right? Yes, we want to keep our Presbyterian faith, but we also want a more intellectual, educated Presbyterian faith. And Fithian comes under that. The Scottish Enlightenment is about kind of progress, improving, liberty, freedom, right? This is why Witherspoon will be one of the only is the only minister to sign the Declaration of Independence, for example, right? Member of the Continental Congress. He wants to not only create ministers steeped and rooted in Presbyterianism, but also statesmen, lawyers. I mentioned Madison, right? Aaron Burr. Lawyers, doctors, and so forth that are going to not only preach and present, be Presbyterian people, but people who have also a vocation of, non-ministerial jobs and callings. And more about that in a second here. But this turns Princeton in a completely different direction. Not completely different, but it changes Princeton. For instance, the third president of Princeton was Jonathan Edwards, the great evangelical revivalist, who really saw Princeton as a place to just train ministers. Right? Witherspoon changes all of that. Now, how does Fithian's training of at Princeton under Witherspoon in the Scottish Enlightenment affect the way he understands the Native Americans he encounters in the story I read? So we looked at how the Native Americans, their situation. Now, how does Fithian perceive that as a young Presbyterian trained in this, great place of learning under Witherspoon? One, he will learn a view of history and what they would have called at the time civilization that plays into almost everything he said in that first story that I read. At Princeton, he not only would have, he would have learned that there are various stages of civilization. This was a classic Scottish thing. Adam Smith, you remember him? Wealth of Nations from your high school civics class. And a bunch of other Scottish Enlightenment thinkers would have talked about this view of civilization, that civilization history is constantly progressing. Right? And the Enlightenment was about progress. In other words, you're sinful, but that doesn't mean you can't make a good, an advanced, improved society. So you start off with hunter-gatherers, peoples, right? Very uncivilized in this model, right? And that's probably somewhere near where Fithian would have seen these Native Americans when he encountered them on the frontier. Remember, he's been deeply educated in this view of this is his worldview, basically. He's part of it, right? Pastoralism, kind of shepherding cultures, right, where you're still nomadic, but you're sheep, you have sheep, or you're tending to animals, and so forth would be the next level of civilization. Then settled agriculture, right? You come in and you farm, right? Which in many ways was Fithian's so-called stage of civilization, growing up farming grain in southern New Jersey, right? And then commercial. Commercial was always tied to freedom, capitalism, right? The idea that you are free not only to trade the way you want in a free market, but you're also free to express your ideas, to express your culture, to grow intellectually, to get educated, right? It's the idea of liberalism, not the sort of, political view today, but the idea of liberal is free, right? A liberal arts education teaches you how to think, to freely think for yourself, right? And this is something that only can be sustained by educating oneself and sort of breaking free from these three previous, wherever you are, and moving up. So Fithian often talks about how, when he returns back after he's a student at Princeton, he returns back and he kind of talks in derogatory ways about his neighbors and so forth. These neighbors believe that. This is actually a case from the diary where he says, these neighbors believe that the sun, the sun revolves around the earth, right? but I studied science at Princeton, and I know from Copernicus, right, that actually it's the other way around. You know, these backward people. Right, it's his idea. So he's not only like, you know, disgusted by the hunting culture of the Native American, he's even disgusted by his own people. You know, it's like, I don't know, your kid comes home from college, and you know, your kid comes home from college, you know, for Thanksgiving after his first semester or her first semester, and they're like, they know everything about the world, and you're completely backward. You know, it's the kind of idea. Sounds familiar, Charlie.
Yeah.
You know, so that's the notion. They've been educated, right? You know, they're now smarter than you. So that's one aspect of what he learned from Witherspoon. The other aspect that he learned from Witherspoon is this sense of what I'm calling here Presbyterian gentility, right? Witherspoon not only taught this farm boy how to preach about the progress of history and civilizations, but also taught them that an educated Presbyterian minister, well, first of all, Presbyterian minister is educated, unlike, say, the Quakers or the Baptists or, you know, some of these other Methodists, some of these other denominations. Now, Anglicans a little different because the Anglicans did have educated ministers. But the Presbyterians prided themselves in this period on having an educated ministry. Some of you remember the history of the Great Awakening, when there was this log college. Gilbert Tennant was training these people, and it wasn't an official college, and the Presbytery wasn't sure whether they would ordain these evangelicals that Gilbert Tennant was training, because they didn't have a formal education, right? So he was not only taught that an educated person knows certain things, like the first point here, but also an educated person carries themselves a certain way. An educated person treats the opposite sex with a certain kind of respect and gentility. An educated person dresses a certain way. An educated person behaves a certain way, like no blood on the floor, right? You know, no, there's another great story where it doesn't have anything to do with the Native Americans, but he's like sleeping in this bed on the frontier, and they give him this. He's very upset because he has to sleep with the whole family in the same room, right? You know, he's a visiting minister, and you know, he wakes up and the kids are running around, and he's embarrassed by this, you know, and then one night he's laying in bed, and a kind of muddy dog jumps through the window and jumps on all his newly ironed and just cleaned clothes, right? And he's almost, you know, he's very kind of, you know, very, you know, I should get much more respect, right? As a genteel, educated, Princeton-trained guy, right? You know, and in some ways, this is something that Witherspoon is trying to teach all his Presbyterian graduates. You know, like, you are the cream of the crop. You should uphold a certain kind of genteel kind of, you know, lifestyle. So, gentility more than evangelism. It's interesting, there's never a point in the diary where Fithian even talks about trying to convert these Native Americans to Christianity. It's more just a derogatory kind of, you know, they're uncivilized, right, in that sense. Now, there were Presbyterian missionaries, don't get me wrong. You would think Fithian as a minister might be one of them, I don't know. But he clearly does not talk about them as objects of conversion. They're objects of backwardness, right? Complete inability to understand the economic and cultural exchange that I was talking about. Like, how could these Presbyterians, these Scots-Irish Presbyterians, this, by the way, also goes back to, there's an ethnic piece here too. This actually goes back to the Scots-Irish. Someone asked me this question last week about the Scots-Irish being seen as uncivilized by English, right? So that may have had something to do with it as well. But he doesn't understand how this Mr. Boggs could let these Indians just walk into his house, right? I mean, this is absurd to him as an educated man. And I think it's fair to say a general sense of superiority over these people. So this is the encounter. This is a story that teases out some things that are going to define kind of Presbyterian ministers over and against other religious figures, and the Presbyterian kind of gentility and education into the late 18th, early 19th century. But it's also going to provide a larger illustration of the way not only Presbyterians, but most white educated people would have thought about when they encountered Native Americans on the frontier. So I'll stop there. We got about 15 minutes or so, and questions, comments, concerns.
The comment that Pythian was a tutor on that,
Yeah.
I'll say plantation for lack of a better term.
Well, that's what they would have called it.
Okay. Was he just tutoring the owners of that plantation or the slaves, or am I putting
No.
slaves into it unnecessarily?
Well, that's a great question. So he was not tutoring the owners, he was tutoring the children
Okay.
of the owners. There were 3 children. He had a separate little, here's another example of, the young Presbyterian gentleman arriving at this incredibly wealthy plantation. Phidian spends most of his free time sitting in Robert Carter III's library, reading. He might as well have been going to London or Paris, when he went to this this plantation. Robert Carter III was one of the wealthiest men in Virginia, and he encounters several enslaved people while he's there. So, Carter has a lot of slaves. He's actually one of the. There's a really good book on Carter talking about how he was one of the first of these great Virginia planters, even before George Washington, to free his slaves at the time of his death. And then he later on joins this cult, almost group in Baltimore called the Swedenborgians, and becomes a member. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. But when he encounters the enslaved, he often teaches them, but informally, through conversations that he records in the diaries. He's never educating them in any kind of formal setting. In fact, there's some great examples of where some of the enslaved people on the plantation put him to shame, because one of the things he learns from the Anglicans is, while his staunch Presbyterians back in New Jersey and Princeton and so forth, they went to church every single Sunday. It was a mark of your kind of spiritual commitment. The Anglicans, because Virginia was an officially Anglican colony, there was a state church, they only were required to go to church, I think it's once or twice a month, I can't remember off the top of my head. So Phidian kind of, would often struggle with this. He would write in his diary things like, I can't believe these Anglicans, are they Christians? That kind of stuff. But then after he was there for a year, he kind of took some weeks off too. And there's one encounter where one of the enslaved members of the Carter plantation sees Phidian kind of walking around the grounds on a Sunday morning, and goes up to Phidian and rebukes him for not being in church. And this throws him for a loop, and he must spend about a page and a half in the diary trying to make sense of this, that perhaps this enslaved person is right. But how could he be right? He's an enslaver. So it's really fascinating. The diaries are fascinating stuff. I talk a little bit about that encounter as well in the book. So he is there to, basically, educate. The Carters liked Presbyterian Witherspoon students because too many of the Anglicans who were students at the College of William and Mary, which was the Anglican college in Virginia, were too prone to partying too much and drinking. So that again. This is all what they were saying, right? So he liked because they were more they were strict, they were disciplined. There's even a reference to like oatmeal eating Presbyterians who are staunch kind of. So a lot of the stereotypes you think about with kind of Presbyterians, as being buttoned down, you got a suit on and a tie today, Charlie, right? These buttoned down kind of staunch moralists, like a Woodrow Wilson or something, is there's some truth to that, rooted in the 18th century Princeton kind of thing. Yeah.
I once worked for a principal who asked me if I went to church, and I said, well, I was a Presbyterian. And he responded, oh, you're a blue soxer.
Yeah.
And I said, what's that mean?
I don't know what that is, yeah.
He said, in this town, Presbyterians think they're better than everybody else.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking 20th century.
Yeah.
And there was this feeling, and he wasn't the only one that kind of expressed this, but there was this feeling that Presbyterians were wealthy and smart. They thought they were smarter than everybody else, and so forth and so on. And that was an atmosphere that pervaded that small church.
Yeah.
We tried going to it for a little while, and we found out that doesn't work.
Well, I think you still. I better be careful on YouTube. You still see some. I'll say it. You still see some of that in some of the more sect Presbyterian kind of break-off groups, like the PCA or the OPC or the familiar with these.
Yeah.
I mean that there's this deep commitment to we're the true Orthodox Presbyterians, or something to that effect. But you can make a lot. Some of that is it could be a stereotype. But reading Fithian's diary and understanding Witherspoon's Princeton, these were the people he wanted to create. They wanted to create these well-educated kind of, I don't think they would have said standoffish or we're better than you mentality, but that's what kind of taken to the extreme, that's what it kind of resulted in. I mean, I'm very hesitant in saying this, but there does seem to be a connection. When I read Fithian and Witherspoon and what they were trying to produce a Princeton, I think about the people in the church you're describing. That would, there's always this ranking within American religious culture, history, right? Usually the Episcopalians think they're the best, right? They're on top, and then the Presbyterians, and then you have those Baptists and early Methodists, who were seen as kind of one step above heathen, because of their enthusiastic revival. That's the other thing, one of the reasons why the First Great Awakening and Second Great Awakening split the Presbyterian Church was that the old side, the traditionalists, they were still upholding this kind of staid and, this sober kind of, I don't mean it in a kind of alcohol way, but just kind of sober, staid kind of Presbyterianism. And, all of a sudden, these other new lights, new sides, they were being caught up in these evangelical revivals. They were being too affected by these revival preachers, who were coming in, and that wasn't true Presbyterianism, right? Kind of thing. So you do see some of that with Fithian. Much of Fithian had a conversion experience, but Witherspoon clearly was not a big fan of revivals and enthusiastic religion, and because at the heart of the Scottish Enlightenment was you were rational. Right? Presbyterian faith for Witherspoon and later Fithian was rational. It was not driven by the passions. In other words, what Fithian would have learned under Witherspoon is that there were two dominant faculties that all human beings had: reason and passion, head and heart. Right? You're born because of sin, with the passions being the dominant, because they're going to always lead you astray. Right? They're going to lead you to sin, the passions. You're going to do something to fulfill your passions. But the point of education, the point of learning, especially within a moral and religious environment, was to train the reason, the faculty of reason, so that it had more. It was almost like the faculty of reason was like a muscle that was trained through education and to be made stronger, so that it could control the unruly passions that could lead you into sin and lead you away from God. right? So I think that's part of when Fithian encounters these Native Americans on the Pennsylvania frontier. Native Americans in a Presbyterian worldview, but also a generally kind of white educated worldview, it doesn't have to be Presbyterians, would have seen these people as unruly, right? Being led by their passions, right? They weren't educated, so of course they're gonna try to scalp you or do something immoral, or, because they are passion-driven people. They have not had the experience of education, and if they had the experience of education, they would be moving towards a more commercial society, a more intellectual society. They would form colleges and universities. They would not act in the way they do with all the killing of venison and blood and all this kind of stuff. So I think that's very much part of the Presbyterian mindset as Fithian encounters these people. Yeah.
During the course of his itinerant ministry, did he help to form congregations by returning to a particular site?
The answer to that is, in this region, no. He was there to preach. They had no preachers. They had no educated ministers. He was there to preach and to, Northumberland, he stayed for probably a month or two, but these other places, he was there for a few days and distributed the sacraments, because they would have never had communion or anything like that. So that's what he was there to do. Some of them had lay people doing the communion, but the minister was the one who, something special when the minister could come and do that. So there's no evidence of him staying and building. Now, he does get, he has a similar trip into the the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, which you saw on that map. And there, you have a much older Scots-Irish population that have taken the Philadelphia Wagon Road through Lancaster, through York, and down into the Wagon Road goes all the way down into the Susquehanna River Valley. He was a much older population, so he ran into a lot of Princeton graduates that were somewhat older than him, who had been down there for years, and these were more stable congregations. But most of those congregations, with the exception of maybe 3 or 4 Princeton grads who were ministering there, usually they had 2 or 3 congregations. Most of the congregations had no minister, so he would get offers, stay. Become our settled minister. That was the term they used, right? And he may have done that, except he was in love. And it's a whole other part of the story, which most people like more than the stuff I gave you today. Betsy, his future wife, was back in Greenwich, and he just got homesick and missed her and said, I can't. He would write, what if I took this pastorate and I would have to, would Betsy be happy here? These kinds of things. And he thought she wouldn't. He wanted to give her a more, a different kind of life. I think that was the big, at least as the diary explains it, that was his big concern about staying and cultivating some kind of strong church in those areas. Plus, he was on assignment, right? He wasn't asked to do that. The Presbyterian was just saying, how do we deal with these people? They need services, they need sermons, they need sacraments, they need, their kids need to be baptized, their babies. And we got to send people out there. So this route, Fithian was not the only young minister to have taken these routes. He was one of many,
Here in the South Central Pennsylvania area, many of our churches were established at the site of an artesian spring.
Yeah.
Is the same thing true
Yes.
in the more central part of the state?
All of these congregations fit that. I'm trying to get back here to the original. No, I gotta put it on slideshow. Yeah, I'll talk as I'm doing it. All of these congregations were, as you can see,